Today we'll be talking about memory and politics, the creation of the Great Patriotic War myth after World War II in the Soviet Union. I'm Tammy Machado with Arizona State University. My thesis today is in response to Stalin's fear of losing power, the Soviet collective memory of the Second World War evolved into a post-war invention of the Great Patriotic War myth. Subsequently, party leaders manipulated this myth politically during the Soviet era to ensure communism and the Socialist Party remained the victor through the Cold War era and the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'll discuss today the Soviet leaders' roles in shaping the Great Patriotic War myth during the post-war communist era and how each used it to mold the individual and collective memories of the war to suit a fluctuating political climate and the needs of the Communist Party. First, we'll touch on the significance of the term Great Patriotic War in Russian-Soviet history. Next, we'll look at Stalin's invocation of the Great Patriotic War during and after World War II. Then we'll turn to Soviet leadership through the Cold War era and how they continued the individual and collective memory shift of the Soviet Union, focusing on the eras of Nikita Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev, and Mikhail Gorbachev, and how they engineered the myth of the Great Patriotic War for political gain. And finally, we'll conclude with the ramifications of the myth today. To understand Stalin's need to reframe the memories of World War II, a brief look at history will aid in context. The term patriotic war holds significant historical meaning from the Russian Patriotic War of 1812, with the word great holding a high status in Russian and Soviet society. Thus, the phrase the Great Patriotic War, used to describe World War II, evoked strong unifying emotions in the Soviet population. The post-World War I era witnessed the rise of Lenin and the Bolsheviks and communism with the creation of the Soviet Union in 1922, resulting in Stalin's complete control of the Communist Party by the end of the decade. Throughout the 1930s, Stalin remained unopposed by design, executing any military or civil servants who opposed him, leaving his nation unprepared militarily when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941. Subsequently, the war raging and millions dead, Stalin selfishly viewed the war as a threat to his power and looked to redirect the narrative of World War II. The Great Patriotic War years of 1941 to 1943 meant death, destruction, and starvation for most Soviet citizens. Thus, individuals began to question Stalin's disastrous unpreparedness that resulted in the isolation of villages and towns. This isolation, however, did provide a temporary liberation from Stalin's dictatorship, since there was little governance of the nation while the invasion ensued and the military gained its bearings. Additionally, veterans received no acknowledgement with stipends or rights, placing an emphasis on the Communist Party over the individual, another consequence of Stalin's aim to rewrite the Soviet narrative of World War II. As a result, photographing or writing about disabled veterans was forbidden, and by 1948, veterans begging on the street were rounded up and taken away, thus removing visual evidence of the war's realities. Finally, Stalin knew the socialist system would carry on regardless of who ruled, adding another reason for Stalin's fear of losing power. This climate necessitated Stalin's invention of the Great Patriotic War myth. In analyzing the state of his nation, Stalin knew enough about the mass casualties of Soviet citizens and soldiers, and that widespread knowledge of this could signal the end of his reign. To forestall this, the government imposed severe censorship on print and film to erase the memory of the bloodshed of World War II and instead focus on unity, bravery, sacrifice, the Socialist Party, and his leadership as the true reason for the victory. Stalin began publicly evoking the Great Patriotic War in a speech that aired on May 9, 1945, saying, "The Great Patriotic War is ended in our complete victory." In addition, a propaganda piece published in 1950 in honor of his 70th birthday was titled "A Commander of the Genius of the Great Patriotic War," reinforcing this myth. In another weakening of Stalin's image, war crime trials and sentences in the Soviet Union began as publicly acknowledged affairs in 1945. However, these became less and less as Stalin realized that such cases distorted the official interpretation of the Great Patriotic War. Additionally, the Nuremberg trials demonstrated that the Soviet reputation was damaged globally after the Soviet Union falsely blamed Germany for the Katyn massacre, combined with Stalin's control over the trials, which created a handicap for Soviet attorneys and seeded mistrust amongst the Allied nations. With these elements in play, Stalin ultimately sought to minimize the damage to his image by redirecting the public to the future of the motherland and communism, invoking the myth of the Great Patriotic War. While Stalin planted the seeds, however, he died in 1953 before the roots of the myth fully took hold. Stalin's death was a shock for the nation. Despite his brutality, he led the country for 30 years through a world war and into the post-war era. The future of the myth and of the Soviet Union rested with who would lead next. Nikita Khrushchev, a World War II veteran, ascended to power after a period of party leadership uncertainty. Early in his administration, Khrushchev made public the atrocities that occurred during the war under Stalin's reign. In addition, Khrushchev publicly denounced Stalin's policies to separate himself from Stalin and solidify his party leadership. In Khrushchev's words, not Stalin, but the party as a whole, the Soviet government, our heroic army, its talented generals and valiant warriors, the whole Soviet people, that's who ensured victory in the Great Patriotic War. As a result, he commissioned the first official history of the Great Patriotic War, a 6-volume tome of the Soviet experience that Khrushchev used to retaliate against the Stalin-era war memory. However, since Khrushchev was a communist first, he ultimately stayed true to Stalin's vision of the motherland and the Great Patriotic War in a feeble attempt to unify the nation. Consequently, Khrushchev's rule proved to be an extension of the Stalinist era, with the history of the Great Patriotic War differing only slightly from Stalin's version, while still echoing the core of the myth. Khrushchev's initial reluctance to push ahead with the war's large-scale veneration is often cited as a feature that distinguished the Khrushchev years from the Brezhnev-era war cult. Moreover, while significantly less influential than Stalin's, Khrushchev's tenure had to grapple with Communist Party politics, something Stalin put down ruthlessly rather than entertained. Even so, he commissioned the framework for the Great Patriotic War in the image of the Communist Party while keeping Stalin's image intact. Leonid Brezhnev's era prompted a time of stability. During his tenure, he promoted the Great Patriotic War as a significant achievement for the Soviet system. Tightly censored during Stalin's reign, propaganda and news correspondents aided this promotion through their increased freedom under Brezhnev. As a result, the Soviet Union endured endless propaganda touting the Great Patriotic War during his rule. Moreover, as decades passed and leadership changed, this patriotic virtue would influence generations. In Brezhnev's ongoing effort to add to the positive image of the myth, a few benefits finally became available to veterans that Stalin's regime had denied. Brezhnev pushed the war myth further during his tenure, ushering in the last leader of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev ascended to power in 1985. He influenced the communist political movement Perestroika, meaning reconstruction, and Glasnost, meaning openness, policies during his tenure. This openness and policy resulted in individual memories finally surfacing, and stories began to emerge. Thus, an open and liberal tone paved the way for those silenced for decades, finally giving voice to the violence of war. As open as his policies remained, in his 1985 Victory Day speech, Gorbachev said, "The roots of the victory are in the nature of socialism, the Soviet way of life. It was a victory of our ideology and morality, therefore reinforcing Stalinist leanings." On the one hand, Gorbachev championed transparency in his policies, but on the other hand, he remained deeply rooted in the Communist Party, with socialism as the victor, further propelling the myth of the Great Patriotic War. Gorbachev evoked the myth to promote unity and cohesion in the mid-1980s, a tumultuous time politically with the war in Afghanistan and the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. Ultimately, the Soviet Union fell under his rule. Today, the problem of Russian identity is still vacillating among many controversial symbols, and the last word has not yet been said. As a result, understanding the myth of the Great Patriotic War is as significant today as ever. Vladimir Putin ascended to the presidency a mere 8 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, at a time when Russia was in crisis. However, one event existed that would bolster public support, aid in foreign policy, and reunify his country: the victory in World War II. Putin believes his current actions in Crimea and Ukraine are a continuation of territory lost in World War II, therefore using the myth of the Great Patriotic War as justification for the invasion of Ukraine today, making the myth and how it continues to influence more crucial each day. Individual memories of World War II fade with the distance of time as the number of living dwindles each day, causing the collective memory to morph into myth for most nations. Stalin sought to reinvent the memories of his people and largely succeeded. Through the leadership of Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and Gorbachev, each using the myth to suit their unique political climate, the myth has endured. The overreaching messaging? Socialism had triumphed. Consequently, much of the individual war experience may never come out, leaving the myths and realities of World War II forever blurred. The Great Patriotic War demonstrated that no force exists in the world that can conquer socialism. Sadly, the Great Patriotic War invocation remains prevalent today, serving as a justification for more war in the 21st century.